All right, let's dive in today. And you know what, we're tackling the Export-Import Bank of the United States.
Or, as most folks know it, EXIM,
Yeah, IXM, exactly. And we're going to be looking at, well, we're diving deep today into a chapter from Mandate for Leadership.
which it lays out two very different opinions about EXIM. One saying get rid of it, the other saying it's absolutely critical.
Right, right. And we'll unpack both of those. But first, just a real quick reminder for anybody who might not be, totally familiar with XM, what is it? What does it actually do?
Basically, it's a government agency, right? And it provides financing to companies, American companies looking to export their products and services.
So trying to help American businesses compete on that global stage, right?
Exactly. With the hope of boosting jobs here in the U.S., the idea is you help these companies export more, they need more workers, everyone wins. But of course, it's not quite that simple.
Right. That's where the debate comes in. So let's jump in with Veronique Derugi
Yeah.
and her argument for, well, she wants to abolish XM.
She does. She doesn't hold back either. Calls it a protectionist agency, picks winners and losers, and ultimately, she thinks, it actually holds back economic growth.
Wow, strong words.
Yeah.
And she even brings in a quote from David Stockman, Reagan's budget director.
Yeah, and he really lays it out there, comparing export subsidies to basically giving away goods for less than what it costs to make them.
Ouch. That's got to sting if you're a supporter of XM.
Yeah, Derucky's really concerned that EXIM messes with natural market forces, creates an unfair advantage for a select few companies.
So kind of goes against that whole free market idea.
Exactly. Now, here's something that I found really interesting. Did you know EXIM was originally created to finance trade with the Soviet Union?
Really, back in the 30s?
1934.
Wow, talk about a different world.
Makes you wonder, right? Is a policy designed for that era? Is it still relevant in the 21st century? Derugi argues absolutely not. And she points to EXIM's total exposure back in 2014 peaked at over $112 billion.
Meaning that's the potential risk to taxpayers, right?
Exactly. A lot of taxpayer money on the line. And get this, there was a period, about 4 years, where EXIM was essentially inactive, didn't have enough board members to actually make decisions.
You'd think that would have been a disaster for U.S. exports.
Right. But guess what? They kept on growing. So Derugi uses this to say, look, EXIM's not as essential as some people claim.
Interesting. So it's not just about this, potential risk to taxpayers. She's also saying it might not even be doing what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, and she really goes after that whole job creation argument, the idea that EXIM creates jobs.
Right.
She says, at best, it's just moving jobs around, not actually creating any new ones.
From one company to another or one industry to another.
Exactly. So it raises the question, are we just shuffling things around instead of actually boosting growth? And here's where her argument gets really interesting. She claims EXIM is actually subsidizing the standards of living in other countries.
Wait, what? How does that work?
Well, think about it. When the government gives subsidies to companies exporting goods, it can lower the price of those goods in foreign markets.
So American taxpayers are helping to make things cheaper for people in other countries.
Pretty much. And this all ties into Derugi's bigger point about market distortions. EGIM interferes with the natural flow of trade, and it might lead to too much of something being produced just because it's subsidized for export.
Instead of producing what the market actually needs.
Right. Now, of course, we got to talk about China. Derucky's pretty skeptical that EXIM can really counter China's economic influence,
Yeah, they're a huge player in the global market these days.
Exactly. And she points out, EXIM hasn't really shifted its focus to compete with China in those key markets.
So what's the solution, according to Derugi?
She's all about that free market approach, right? Create a business-friendly environment here in the U.S., tax cuts, deregulation, that kind of thing. Let businesses compete on a level playing field without the government picking winners and losers.
Interesting. So basically she's saying focus on making the U.S. the best place to do business, and the exports will follow.
Exactly. All right, so back to EXIM, right? Where do we stand?
Well, we've got these two completely different views, right? You've got Veronique Derugi, who's basically saying XM is outdated, messes up the market, and really just props up those big companies.
And then there's Jennifer Hazelton, who's arguing that, look, in this global economy, especially with China, EXIM is more crucial than ever.
It really boils down to, what is the best way to help American businesses and workers? I mean, is it through the government stepping in, like XM does? Or is it about just creating a good environment here in the U.S., tax cuts, less regulation, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, two very different approaches, and both, let's be honest, they have their pluses and minuses.
For sure. On the one hand, government intervention, sometimes it can backfire, right? You end up picking winners and losers. Maybe resources aren't used the best way. But then again, just focusing on what's happening domestically, maybe that's not enough when you've got other countries actively using these export credits and stuff to help their own industries.
And, I mean, we can't forget about China here, right? They've become such a force in global trade, and they're definitely using those export credits strategically. It's something the U.S. can't just ignore.
So the big question is, how do we respond? Do we get into, like, a subsidy war with China?
Yeah.
I mean, that could escalate things, make markets even more distorted?
Or maybe the focus should be on making our economy strong here at home, attract investment, encourage innovation.
It's tricky, right? No easy answers.
Yeah.
But it's so important to have these conversations, to really think about the pros and cons of each approach.
Absolutely. This isn't just about, theories and stuff. This is about American businesses, American workers. The decisions we make about exusos and trade, they have real consequences for jobs, wages, the whole economy.
Right. It's about people's lives, ultimately. So we really want to encourage you, as you're listening, to think critically about all this. Don't just take one side's word for it,
Exactly. Look at the evidence, form your own opinion. Because it can complex, this deserves real thought.
All right, let's take a step back for a second. Look at the history of EXIM. It's been around for a long time, almost 90 years, and it's had its ups and downs. Started with financing trade with the Soviet Union, then expanded to other countries.
Yeah, we mentioned it was basically inactive for a few years, not enough board members, but then it was reauthorized in 2019, and part of that was about countering China's influence.
Right, there were some new rules, like making EXIM come up with programs specifically to compete with Chinese exports. But some people argue it hasn't really changed that much.
Yeah, it's still mostly supporting big companies, like in aerospace, instead of focusing on where China's really the biggest threat.
And this brings up another important point, transparency. EXIM's been criticized for being kind of secretive about how it makes decisions.
It makes it tough, right, to really see the costs and benefits of its programs because they don't always give clear data about what they're doing.
Which makes it harder to hold them accountable, to make sure they're really working for American taxpayers and businesses.
Exactly. We need more information, right? Like, which companies are benefiting? How are these programs being evaluated? What are the risks for taxpayers?
That's essential if we're going to have an open, honest discussion about ICSIM.
Now, let's zoom out a bit. Think about ICSIM in the bigger picture of global trade.
Right, because it's not the only game in town, is it?
Nope. Almost every major economy has its own version of EXIM, and they're all trying to help their own exporters. It's like this massive network of subsidies and incentives, and honestly, it can distort the market, make it hard to tell which companies are actually competitive on their own.
There have been attempts to, make things fair, level the playing field, but it's tough because different countries have different goals, different priorities.
For sure. It's a delicate balance. Countries want to help their industries, but without triggering this race to the bottom where everyone's just offering bigger and bigger subsidies.
And that's what makes the whole EXIM debate so interesting. It's not just about should it exist or not.
It's about how the U.S. can compete effectively in a global economy where everyone else is using all these different tools to help their businesses.
It's about finding that balance, right? Helping American exports, but also protecting American taxpayers.
And ultimately, it's about having a smart, strategic approach to trade that makes sense for the 21st century.
So as we finish up this part of our deep dive, here's something to think about. The EXIM debate, it's really a debate about the future of American economic power, isn't it?
It is. It's about how the U.S. stays a leader in a world that's more and more competitive, more complex.
And it's about making sure the choices we make today lead to a stronger, more prosperous America for the future.
Right, decisions with real consequences. So stick with us as we keep exploring to
Okay, so we spent all this time talking about EXIM, right? From its, well, kind of strange beginnings, finance and trade with the Soviet Union, all the way to how it fits into today's world with, China's economic rise.
And we've heard those two very different perspectives, right? Veronique de Rugy, she sees EXIM as this wasteful program that distorts markets. Jennifer Hazelton, she thinks it's absolutely essential for American businesses to stay competitive.
So now, as we wrap things up, we want to turn it over to you, the listener.
Exactly. What are your thoughts on all this? What really stood out to you in this whole ICSIM discussion?
We've seen how, some people view EXIM as a way to level the playing field for American companies, especially when they're up against foreign competitors who get support from their own governments.
But of course, we also heard those concerns about, the potential downsides, the risk of picking winners and losers, distorting markets, and that whole argument that EXIM mostly benefits big corporations, maybe at the expense of smaller businesses.
It's tough, right? No easy answer. And that's what makes this whole topic so interesting. It really forces us to think about those big questions, like what role should the government have in a free market economy? And how do we best help American businesses compete in a world that's changing so fast?
Yeah, those are big questions. So as you keep thinking about EXIM, here are a few key takeaways.
First, remember this whole debate often comes down to two different ways of thinking free markets versus government intervention.
And understanding those ideas, those ideologies, it can really help make sense of the arguments on both sides.
Second, let's not forget the global trade landscape has changed a lot in recent decades. China's rise as a major economic power. It's created both challenges and opportunities for American businesses.
Right. Any conversation about EXIM has to consider that global context, how things are changing.
And third, and this is important, don't forget about the people involved in all this. The decisions made about EXIM, they affect real people. American workers, businesses, whole communities.
So think about these questions as you're forming your own opinion about EXIM.
What should the U.S. government's role be in helping American businesses compete overseas?
Is it through direct financing, like EXIM does? Or is it about creating a better business environment here at home?
Or maybe it's a bit of both.
And what are the potential downsides, the unintended consequences of each approach?
These are tough questions, no doubt. But by talking about them, by really thinking them through, hopefully we can find solutions that work for everyone.
Okay, and before we go, we want to leave you with something to ponder. This wasn't directly addressed in what we read today, but it's worth thinking about.
What if XM did go away, like Derugi wants? What would happen then? What other ways could we support American businesses when they're up against those state-backed companies in places like China?
Could the private sector step in, fill that gap, or would we need some new government programs?
It's something to think about as you keep exploring this whole issue, which, let's be honest, is always evolving.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of EXIM. Hopefully you've got a better understanding of the arguments for and against it, a little bit of the history, and the challenges it faces in today's global economy.
Definitely. Keep researching, keep thinking critically about this important topic, and most importantly, form your own informed opinion.
Thanks for listening.